The botanical research bays of the horizon's edge hummed with the quiet efficiency of artificial ecosystems, each chamber maintaining precise atmospheric conditions for specimens that had never felt Earth's sun. Dr. Ethan Cross moved between the cultivation pods with practiced care, monitoring growth cycles and chemical balances that kept alien flora thriving in the sterile environment of deep space. "Morning report, Bay 7, he said to his recording device, documenting another day in what had become 18 months of meticulous routine. The Kepler 186F moss samples are showing increased bioluminescence in response to the modified light spectrum. Recommend extending the current photoperiod by 2 hours to encourage reproductive cycle initiation." The intercom crackled with the ship's daily status update, Commander Lyrel's voice carrying its usual professional precision as she briefed the crew on navigation status and mission parameters. Ethan paused in his work, listening to the cadence of her speech more than the content. There was something about her voice that caught his attention despite himself, a musical quality that made even routine operational updates sound like poetry. "Dr. Cross, please report to the command briefing at 1400 hours, the intercom added. "Priority research assessment required." Ethan glanced at his chronometer, noting he had 3 hours to complete his current cultivation protocols before the meeting. These briefings had become a regular part of his schedule, though he wondered why a botanical researcher warranted such frequent command attention. Most expedition scientists submitted their reports through standard channels and rarely interacted directly with ship's officers. The cultivation chamber's environmental controls chimed, indicating optimal conditions had been achieved for the day's most delicate specimens. Ethan moved to the specialized containment unit, where he maintained samples from the mission's most significant discovery, crystalline flowers from a world where plant life had evolved empathic properties that defied conventional botanical understanding. "You're responding well to the artificial environment," he told the specimen, a habit of speaking to his plants that would have amused his colleagues back at the Research Institute. "Though I suspect you miss your homeworld's triple sunset." The flower's translucent petals shifted color subtly, a phenomenon that occurred whenever Ethan spent extended time near the specimen. He documented the behavior but couldn't explain it. The plant seemed to respond to his presence in ways that suggested awareness beyond simple phototropic reactions. His comm unit chimed with a priority message from the command deck. "Dr. Cross, the commander requests your presence for a preliminary discussion before the formal briefing, when convenient." "When convenient." Ethan noted the unusual courtesy. Military requests typically carried more imperative language. Commander Lyrel's communications consistently demonstrated a consideration for civilian personnel that exceeded standard protocols, though he'd attributed it to her species' diplomatic traditions rather than personal preference. He secured his specimens and made his way through the ship's corridors, passing crew members from a dozen different worlds whose expertise had made the expedition possible. The horizon's edge represented one of the galaxy's most ambitious botanical research missions, and Ethan still felt honored to have been selected for the team. Commander Lyrel's office occupied a section of the command deck that balanced military efficiency with aesthetic appreciation for the worlds they'd visited. Specimen cases lined the walls, displaying samples that had caught her attention during their survey missions. Her pointed ears and graceful bearing marked her as celestial accord nobility, though she wore her authority with understated elegance that put civilian personnel at ease. "Dr. Cross, thank you for coming." She gestured to a chair beside her desk rather than the formal briefing area. "I wanted to discuss your latest findings before presenting them to the full science team." "Of course, Commander. Though I should mention that the empathic specimens continue to exhibit behaviors that challenge our current understanding of plant consciousness." "Yes, I've been following your reports with considerable interest." Lyrel activated a holographic display showing the crystalline flowers in their native environment. Tell me, do you believe consciousness is limited to traditionally recognized sentient species? The question surprised him with its philosophical depth. I think consciousness might be more widespread than we assume. These plants demonstrate awareness and response patterns that suggest some form of subjective experience. An intriguing perspective, one that could reshape how we approach botanical research across the galaxy. The survey shuttle descended through Kepler 442c's atmosphere like a silver leaf, falling through layers of amber light, its sensors recording atmospheric data, while Ethan pressed his face to the observation port in wonder. Below them stretched the Whispering Gardens, an ecosystem where crystalline formations bloomed with living color across rolling hills that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat. Preliminary scans indicate the plant life exhibits electromagnetic signatures consistent with neural activity, reported Lieutenant Torres from the pilot's seat, though the readings are unlike anything in our botanical databases. Commander Lyrel occupied the co-pilot's position, her attention focused on the sensor displays with an intensity that suggested personal investment beyond standard mission parameters. Dr. Cross, what are your initial observations? Ethan studied the landscape through the shuttle's enhanced imaging systems, noting formations that defied conventional understanding of plant behavior. The crystalline structures appear to be integrated with organic components in ways that blur the distinction between mineral and living matter. If these are plants, they've evolved along paths completely unlike terrestrial flora. Perhaps the distinction between living and non-living matter is less absolute than we assume, Lyrel observed, her voice carrying a thoughtful quality that caught Ethan's attention. The shuttle touched down in a clearing surrounded by formations that rose like frozen music, their surfaces reflecting the planet's triple suns in pattern that seemed almost deliberately artistic. Ethan stepped onto alien soil with the reverence of someone witnessing evolution's most creative moments, his portable scanners immediately registering energy patterns that made conventional botanical analysis seem primitive. "Commander, you should see this," he called, kneeling beside a cluster of crystalline flowers that responded to his presence with subtle color changes. They're reacting to proximity, but not in ways consistent with phototropic or gravitropic responses. Lyrel approached the formation, her movements careful and respectful. As she drew near, the flowers' colors intensified, their crystalline petals shifting through spectrums that seemed to mirror the warm tones of her skin and the deep violet of her eyes. "They appear to be responding to emotional resonance," she observed, "as if they're detecting and reflecting our feelings." Ethan watched in fascination as the plants continued their color dance, noting that the display became more complex and beautiful when both he and Lyrel were present together. "It's as if they're responding to the harmony between us," he said, then immediately felt heat rise in his cheeks at the implications of his words. "Perhaps they are." Lyrel's response carried no embarrassment, only thoughtful consideration. "On my homeworld, we have ancient teachings about consciousness as a shared property rather than individual possession. These plants might be demonstrating that principle in biological form." They spent hours documenting the garden's remarkable properties, working together with an efficiency that surprised them both. Ethan's scientific methodology complemented Lyrel's intuitive understanding of the specimen's emotional dimensions, their different approaches creating insights neither could have achieved alone. The resonance patterns suggest these plants evolved in an environment where emotional harmony contributed to ecosystem stability, Ethan noted as they prepared specimens for transport. "They're not just responding to our feelings, they're encouraging positive emotional states that promote cooperation. A biological imperative for empathy," Lyrel mused, carefully placing a crystalline specimen in the transport container. "How remarkably hopeful." The specimen container's environmental controls activated, maintaining the atmospheric conditions necessary for the plant's survival during transport. Ethan watched the flowers adjust to their new environment, their colors settling into patterns that seemed almost peaceful despite being separated from their native ecosystem. "Commander, may I ask you something?" Ethan said as they completed their collection protocols. "Of course. You seem to understand these plants in ways that go beyond standard military or scientific training. Is there something about your background that prepared you for this kind of discovery?" Lyrel paused in securing the specimen containers, considering her response. "My people have always believed that consciousness extends beyond individual boundaries. These plants represent living proof of concepts we've held as philosophical truths for centuries. And you volunteered for this mission because you suspected we might find evidence of those concepts." "I volunteered for this mission because I believed it was important to have someone present who could recognize such evidence when we found it." She met his eyes directly. "I'm glad that someone turned out to be unnecessary." "Unnecessary?" "Because you recognized it yourself, Dr. Cross. Without any philosophical preparation or cultural context, you saw these plants for what they truly are, bridges between consciousness and compassion." The specialized cultivation chamber Ethan designed for the Whispering Garden specimen became a sanctuary within the horizon's edge, its crystalline walls creating an environment where empathic plants could thrive while maintaining their remarkable properties. The chamber's atmospheric controls replicated Kepler 442c's unique conditions, from the precise humidity levels to the electromagnetic field patterns that seemed essential to the flower's consciousness. The neural activity readings are consistent with what we observed planetside, Ethan reported during his daily briefing with Commander Lyrel, though these sessions had evolved far beyond standard progress reports. More importantly, the specimens continue to demonstrate emotional responsiveness despite being removed from their native ecosystem. Lyrel studied the cultivation chamber through its transparent walls, watching the crystalline flowers pulse with gentle bioluminescence. "They seem content, as if they understand their role in our research efforts." "Sometimes I think they do understand." Ethan activated the chamber's internal monitoring systems, displaying energy patterns that resembled neural networks more than traditional plant physiology. Their electromagnetic signatures become more complex when we're both present, almost as if they're responding to the interaction between us rather than just our individual presence. "Perhaps they are." Lyrel approached the chamber's control console, her movements carrying the same careful respect she'd shown on the planet's surface. "My people have a concept called harmonic consciousness, the idea that awareness becomes more complete when different perspectives combine in cooperation rather than competition." Ethan found himself watching her face as she spoke, noting the way her expression softened when discussing philosophical concepts that clearly held personal meaning. "Your people seem to understand connection in ways that human psychology is only beginning to explore. And human science demonstrates that connection through empirical research in ways my people have never attempted." She turned to meet his gaze. "Together, we're learning things neither of our species could discover alone." The observation hung between them with implications that extended beyond botanical research. Ethan had become increasingly aware that his anticipation of these daily briefings had little to do with scientific protocol, and everything to do with the intellectual intimacy they developed through shared discovery. "Commander, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course, Ethan." The use of his first name, a development that had occurred gradually over their weeks of collaboration, created an atmosphere of informal trust despite their different ranks and species. "Why did you really volunteer for this mission? And please don't tell me it was just professional duty." Lyrel considered her response while studying the empathic flowers, their colors shifting through warm spectrums that seemed to encourage honesty. Because I've spent my career in positions where understanding others was essential for successful outcomes. But I'd never encountered anyone who approached that understanding from a scientific rather than intuitive perspective. That you were curious about human methods of building connection. I was curious about you specifically, Dr. Cross. She met his eyes directly, her expression carrying a vulnerability that transformed her usual command presence into something more personal. Your research proposals demonstrated an approach to consciousness that aligned with my people's philosophical traditions while maintaining rigorous scientific methodology. I wanted to see how those different approaches might work together. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he processed the implications of her admission. You've been observing my work for longer than this mission. I've been following your publications for 3 years. When this expedition was proposed, I specifically requested assignment as commander because it meant working with you. The cultivation chamber's environmental controls hummed quietly as the empathic flowers responded to the emotional currents in the room, their bioluminescence intensifying with colors that seemed to celebrate the honesty passing between the chamber's observers. Lyrel, Ethan said quietly, using her name without military protocol for the first time. What happens when this mission ends? Officially, we return to our respective duties and submit our research for peer review. She paused, watching the flowers pulse with increasing brilliance. Unofficially, I've been hoping we might find reasons to continue our collaboration. Reasons like what? Like the possibility that some discoveries are too important to abandon when convenient mission parameters end. She gestured toward the thriving specimens. These plants represent more than botanical curiosities. They're living proof that consciousness and connection can transcend the boundaries we assume are absolute. Ethan moved closer to the cultivation chamber, noting how the flowers' response patterns became more complex as he and Lyrel shared the same space. They do seem to approve of our partnership. Perhaps they recognize something we're still learning to acknowledge ourselves. The final week aboard the Horizon's Edge carried the weight of completion and separation, with crew members preparing for reassignment, while Ethan worked frantically to secure his specimens for transfer to various research institutions across the galaxy. The botanical chambers buzzed with activity as preservation protocols were implemented, and transportation containers were prepared for the specimens that would continue their existence in laboratories far from the ship, where they'd found temporary sanctuary. Transfer manifest complete, Ethan reported to his personal log, though his voice lacked the satisfaction that should have accompanied a successful mission. All specimens secured for transportation except. He paused, looking at the cultivation chamber where one perfect crystalline flower continued to thrive despite being separated from its planetary ecosystem. The empathic blossom had become something special during their journey, its colors shifting with remarkable beauty whenever Ethan or Commander Lyrel were present. Unlike the other specimens destined for institutional research, this single flower seemed to exist for its own sake, a living work of art that bridged the gap between scientific discovery and emotional truth. Dr. Cross, please report to the command deck. Lyrel's voice through the intercom carried the formal precision required for official duties, though Ethan had learned to detect the subtle variations that revealed her personal feelings beneath military protocol. He found her in her office, surrounded by the administrative requirements that marked mission completion, status reports, crew evaluations, and transfer orders that would scatter the expedition team across their respective home worlds and new assignments. The specimen cases that had decorated her walls were being packed for shipment, their contents destined for museums and research facilities, where they would be studied by scientists who had never experienced the wonder of discovering them in their native environments. Ethan, I wanted to discuss your research continuation proposals before we reach the gateway, Lyrel said, gesturing to a chair beside her desk. The Celestial Accord Science Council has expressed significant interest in establishing a permanent botanical research partnership. A partnership. Ethan felt his pulse quicken despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. What kind of partnership? The kind that would allow continued collaboration between human and celestial accord researchers, with you serving as primary Earth liaison for empathic plant research. She activated a holographic display showing proposed research facilities and funding allocations. It would require permanent relocation to Accord space, but the resources available would exceed anything possible through traditional Earth institutions. Ethan studied the proposal, noting the comprehensive support for research that could revolutionize understanding of consciousness and connection across species boundaries. More importantly, he noted that the project structure seemed designed around continued collaboration between himself and Lyrel, their different approaches recognized as essential to the program's success. "This is remarkable," he said. "Though I have to ask, is this offer based purely on scientific merit, or are there other factors influencing the Accord's interest?" Lyrel's expression softened with the vulnerability he'd learned to recognize during their weeks of working together. "The scientific merit is unquestionable. Your research has produced insights that my people's most accomplished philosophers couldn't achieve through centuries of theoretical exploration. But I would be lying if I claimed purely objective motivations for proposing this partnership." She stood and moved to the packed specimen cases, touching one gently. "Working with you has shown me possibilities I didn't know existed for combining different approaches to understanding consciousness and connection." Ethan joined her beside the cases, noting how their proximity seemed to create an atmosphere of shared purpose, despite the impending separation that awaited them at mission's end. "Lyrel, about these possibilities." "Yes, I've been thinking about them too. About how some discoveries can't be properly understood by individual researchers working in isolation." He gestured toward the corridor leading to the botanical chambers. "Those plants taught us that consciousness becomes more complete when different perspectives combine in harmony." "They did." She turned to face him directly, her expression carrying hope tinged with uncertainty. "But applying that lesson to our personal situation seems complicated, inevitable." The word escaped before she could reconsider it, carrying with it weeks of suppressed feelings and unspoken possibilities. Ethan felt his careful professional restraint dissolve as he realized they were finally approaching the conversation they'd been avoiding since their first collaboration on Kepler 442c. "There's something I want to give you before this mission officially ends." He returned to the botanical chambers and retrieved the single perfect crystalline flower that had thrived under their combined care, its petals shifting through warm spectrums that seemed to reflect the emotional resonance between them. When he offered it to Lyrel, the gesture felt both simple and profound. A scientist sharing his most precious specimen with someone who understood its significance beyond monetary or research value. "Ethan," she said softly, accepting the flower with reverence appropriate to its beauty and meaning, "this is a token of partnership," he said. "Scientific, personal, and everything in between." Lyrel held the blossom carefully, watching its colors intensify with what could only be described as joy. "You should know," she said, meeting his eyes with the honesty that had characterized their best moments together. "I was waiting for this. For you to make this gesture, for us to acknowledge what we've discovered together." "Waiting sooner?" Ethan asked, confused by her phrasing. "I was waiting sooner than I should have been," Lyrel clarified with a smile that transformed her composed features into something radiant. "From our first conversation about consciousness and connection, I hoped you might see the possibilities I was seeing. I've been anticipating this moment for longer than professional protocol should have allowed." The crystalline flower in her hands pulsed with bioluminescent approval, its empathic properties responding to the harmony finally acknowledged between two researchers who had discovered that some connections transcend the boundaries of species, duty, and the vast distances between stars.